back in the day with the Hopkins study participants who used psychedelic mushrooms. It was for the near-death experience.
For mysticism.
Mysticism experience, okay. For the psilocybin communication mystical experiences study that Hopkins did, Michael got access to a lot of the participants and he did a piece about this a few years back, and has also done a lot of, I guess, other research in the realm, and is going to tell us a little bit about putting the magic back into magic mushrooms. And over to you, man.
Well, thank you. First, thanks. Really appreciate the organization that went into this. It's been fantastic so far, and I feel like Rick Doblin really set me up for a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about. So that was really nice. Thank you, Rick. So yeah, I thought about how to introduce this, how to talk about my psychedelic experiences, which started a long time ago, and really. What I'm seeing lately is so incredibly exciting to me, the fact that we can talk about this stuff publicly, which we couldn't do a long time ago. And I've been fascinated. When I was a kid, I had this Time Life book called The Mind. And in that book, you know that too? Yeah, there was a picture of a woman holding a rose, and she was just staring at this rose. And it said underneath, she had taken LSD, and it talked about all the experiences she was having. I was probably 8, 9 years old. I got this out of my elementary school library. I'm like, I gotta find out about this stuff. I was primed for psychedelics as a kid. But I really have to say that the experiences I've had over the years have ranged everything from, like Rick talked about, being in a teepee with the Native American church, DMT experiences, psilocybin, etc. I don't want to go down the line. And it's all in the past, of course, so there's no statute of limitations, of course. And MDMA in particular, really, I credit that with helping me sort of become the kind of person I am. So this stuff really informs who I am. It informs what I write about. I've written 2 books, both of which have psychedelic episodes in them, people taking psychedelics. So, I can't even write fiction without, incorporating that kind of stuff into it. And this came up, so I'm interjecting this before I start going through the slides, but I'm talking about magic tonight. It was a really kind of magical experience I had that also really speaks a lot about policy. And that's, when I discovered MDMA, it was like a revelation. The fact that I could be in touch with parts of myself and my heart could open like that with other people. It was really a revelation. And so what I did, I found a book. I think Bruce Eisner wrote a book called Ecstasy, the MDMA Story. Fantastic book. So I had to pre-order it from a bookstore. So the day it arrived, I grabbed the book and I went and sat, waiting for my girlfriend to get off work at a Ruby Tuesdays, okay, in Glen Burnie, Maryland. So I'm sitting there reading this book and I'm just, wrapped up in it. And a woman came over. It's like, excuse me, can I ask why you're reading that? And I thought, is she a narc? What should I say? She seemed really kind of nice. So I said, well, I've done this and found it incredibly valuable and helpful me as a person. I went on and expounded a bit. And she said, well, I actually work in a lab at Johns Hopkins where we're researching that compound. So she gave me her card. I called up the lab. I got in touch with the head researcher. His name is George Ricarte. Okay? So I get on the phone with George Ricarte. I'm like, this stuff needs to be in therapy. I started, going on and on as I was wont to do, 20-something years old that was, before I became a crotchety old man. And so I'm going on and on. He said, I don't think you should do that stuff. I don't think you should do it. I said, well, why? Do you know any physical bad effects? Again, well, we don't know anything. But so he was really discouraging. And later I found out George Ricarte's lab was associated with the big stories about how MDMA was so bad for people. Brain scans they were showing, lesions in people's brains, stuff like this. And people still think that's the truth. Well, guess what? By some strange coincidence, he was giving his monkeys methamphetamine and not MDMA. And he said that it was a mix-up by the people who were shipping them the chemicals, okay? Maybe true, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, but it's interesting how much money was going into his lab when he was churning out these stories about how terrible MDMA was. So I took that as kind of a cautionary tale, and I learned quite a bit. So anyway, that just came to me, thanks to Rick. But let's get into putting the magic back in magic mushrooms. And this is a topic that makes some people uncomfortable. It makes me a little uncomfortable sometimes. And what's happening is fantastic. What we're seeing, the medicalization, the decriminalization of psychedelics, fantastic. I am 100% behind it. But I feel like we're missing part of the equation. And being someone that's always been a little drawn to the sort of the edges, Rick was talking about the edge, you can walk out on if you're pure. I don't know if I'm pure enough to go out, but I'll go out on the edge anyway. And so let's talk about magic and what we mean when we talk about magic mushrooms. Next slide, please. Just again, a little bit of my background. This book, Fingerprints of God, is written by Barbara Bradley Haggerty, who's an NPR religion correspondent. She had a really profound experience of her own, not drug assisted at all. But through her life, she's been trying to understand that. So she interviewed me about my psilocybin, 2 experiences I had for this book. Next slide, please. And this Michael was talking about this. This is the article I wrote for the Baltimore City paper. Unfortunately, they redid their website and it's gone. All the photos, everything. But it's still on Alternet. So if you look up Sacred Intentions on Alternet, you can still read the article. It was the first feature article on the psilocybin and mysticism experience. And I had access to 4 people who were volunteers. It was the first time they let anyone have that kind of access. And that's because I know the people involved. I had let them, I let them know early on that I really supported the research, struck up relationships with Roland Griffiths and his team. And so they trusted me. They trusted I wasn't going to do a hit piece. Because there was research that was stymied in Baltimore. At one point, there was going to be LSD research in the 1980s. There was a safe of LSD in the researcher's office, a DEA certified safe. And the researcher talked to someone from Esquire magazine. And Esquire magazine wrote an article, and on the front cover they had someone's melting face. It was a really sensationalistic story. Because of that, that LSD research got shut down. And it wasn't until Griffiths in 2000s that things actually got started again. So they're really, they were really concerned about journalists sensationalizing what they were doing. So I really had to convince them I was going to do a very fair piece about the science that they were doing. Next, please. And there's Roland Griffiths. That's who we owe a lot of our progress to right there. The people that work in his lab were excruciatingly careful about the protocols they were building up. That's good, that's cool, you can go. And this is the first paper that came out about psilocybin inducing mystical type experiences. I mean, Roland thought this was going to be impossible to do. He said psychedelic research was the 3rd rail of research. And he made it happen. And he made it happen by being scrupulous, by being smart about the way he designed the protocols. And it really did open the floodgates for the research that we're seeing right now. And could you go back one?
Yes,
Go back one more. That's the psilocybin room. I was one of the first journalists to be able to go in there. There's a nice couch. They've got a Buddha statue. They've got this little mushroom sculpture and books and this great abstract painting. I mean, they really put a lot of time into making the environment really comforting and but kind of visionary at the same time. So skip ahead to, okay. So let's go back one. So this is, here's something I encourage everybody to do. it's been really an interesting, enlightening thing that I've done. As I said, when I started doing the research for that article, I set a Google alert for psilocybin, just the word psilocybin, okay? So now that we've got all this research coming out, these are the sorts of stories that pop up. The research, I mean, it's really, you know, it hasn't gotten out to the public like it needs to, but the ball is rolling along, okay? So we see people are starting to understand these things are medicine, okay? They're medicinal. That's getting through. Next slide, please. This is also the message. It's still, unfortunately, the big message when you get the Google alerts every day. Could you go to the next one, please? Look at it. This I just picked kind of at random a couple days ago. Police sees large stash of psychedelic mushrooms South Austin. Blah, blah, blah. Dozens of pounds. This cracks me up. Okay. This is the level of intelligence that we're dealing with in law enforcement. They're afraid the spores of the mushrooms are going to inhale them and I guess come to realizations about their lives or something. So I mean, that's one absurdity here. Next. And look at this. This is what killed me. Like, who writes this stuff? Volk said grow operations often are set up in quiet neighborhoods. Suspects are looking to eschew any attention, so they will often have 9-to-5 jobs. Right? Oh, I think I want to set up a psilocybin growing operation, so I better get a job to hide what I'm doing. You know, I mean, the absurdity of this, the absolute absurdity. Next, please. But let's go back way, way, way back in time, where we see some of the first pictorial representations of what may be the use of psychoactive mushrooms. This is in southeast Algeria, the Tassili Plateau. It's called Plateau of Chasms. I mean, look how crazy that is. It's all desert now. But back in the day when we're going to take a look at this rock art, it was lush, verdant, animals everywhere, vegetation everywhere. Does anybody recognize this guy? This is roughly 10,000 years old. Okay, this is what they call one of the Tassili mushroom shaman. Next, please. This guy has sort of become, you may have seen him on t-shirts and things. I call him the psilocybin Cocopelli. You know, I mean, he's really starting to represent the idea that psilocybin's been part of human consciousness since the Neolithic era. Then we jump ahead a little bit. Whoops, not that far ahead. That's okay. And we're looking at, this is Greek, this is Demeter and Persephone, right? And there are scholars who believe that the Eleusinian mysteries, the mystery cults in Greece, actually may have used psychoactive mushrooms. And, whoops, you see they're kind of, go back, I'm sorry. See, it looks like they're kind of holding mushrooms. Sorry, it keeps jumping, does it? I'm sorry.
It has a timer on it.
Oh, it does? Oh, I'm sorry about that. If you can go back one, though, so I can just finish that slide. That's Stonehenge. This is a close-up. You know, it depends on who you talk to. Some people think it's axes. Sure looks like it could be mushrooms, too. And there's a cave in Spain from about 6,000 years ago where it's very clearly mushrooms are shown. Why are they drawing mushrooms on the cave walls? I don't know. Next slide, please. Here's when we get a little closer to our time. And this is in Mexico, Central America, the mushroom stones. We have these funny little mushrooms maybe popping out of their heads, either that or it's aliens, right? And we look over here and there's people dancing around a mushroom. Okay, these are indicative of Mesoamerica, that, you know, for thousands of years, people may have used mushrooms ritually. And these sparked some circumstances that led to the fact that we actually know about these mushrooms now. That's the cool history I'm going to talk about next, please. Next slide. Anybody ever see this Life magazine cover? Okay. Anybody know who that guy is? Have you ever seen The Wizard of Oz? Does he look like the Cowardly Lion? Maybe that's actually Bert Lahr, the Cowardly Lion. But the important thing about this issue, which was May 13th, 1957, is the discovery of mushrooms that cause strange visions. And this is the history. This is the reason why we're talking about psilocybin today. So you should know this history. This article, next slide. Oh man, my transition. I had this curtain transition. Just like, this article pulled back the curtains. So imagine curtains going. This is the article that brought psilocybin-containing mushrooms to the world's attention. That woman is Maria Sabina. We're going to be talking about her a little bit. And if we can get the sound to work at the end, we can actually listen to her do one of her chants, which is really spectacular. This is R. Gordon Wasson. He was a banker, a vice president of J.P. Morgan. And how he got interested in mushrooms was he married his wife. She was Russian. And one day she decided to go pick mushrooms for their dinner that night. Well, he thought for sure, I'm sorry that I keep happening. It wants to go ahead. We have to slow it down. His wife went and picked some mushrooms, and he was so afraid of mushrooms, he was a mycophobe, that he was certain he was going to die. But he's like, well, it's great, we've been married for a few days, and now you're going to kill me with these mushrooms. He was so afraid of mushrooms, he really thought she was going to poison him. And when he didn't die, he started thinking, why are people so afraid of mushrooms? Like, what's the fear of a mushroom? And that started him looking into the culture of mushrooms in Russia. He saw some of those strange little mushroom stones, started reading accounts of the Spaniards when they kind of went through and terrorized and conquered Mexico. Their accounts of people eating these funny mushrooms, which of course the priest said were the work of the devil. They compared it to, because the Mexicans who were eating the mushrooms were saying, this is God. And the Spaniards saw that as like, no, the only God you can eat is communion, so that's of the devil. So they drove that practice underground. But there were little traces of that in the literature. So R. Gordon Wasson decided he was going to find out if there were still mushroom cults in Mexico. And there were little interesting, tantalizing little pieces in literature here and there, but no one knew for sure. Next, please. So here he is. He met this woman. We're going to get to know her very well shortly. But that's Gordon Wasson there, eating mushrooms. He was the first Western, white, Caucasian person, non-indigenous person, maybe ever, to eat psilocybin-containing mushrooms. Next, please. And this is cool because Rick brought this up about how psychedelic therapy, what do? They put you in a dark room, right? You're lying down, you're comfortable, you're listening to music, but the music is by the curandera, or the healer, okay? That's not new. Do you know where they got psychedelic therapy from? From the indigenous people. That's how they did it. See everyone lying down there? Right? That's what they did. You would lie down in darkness and listen to the music of the healer, okay, who's there to heal you, because that's what it was about, was healing, divination, and magic. Next, please. So here she is, Maria Sabina. Some people consider her a saint. I kind of consider her a saint. If it hadn't been for her, she agreed to take Wasson to what they called a velada. That's a Spanish word. It was like a vigil. A night vigil is what they called when they would have their ceremonies, okay? She was a Mazatec. She was a sabia, or a wise one. There are different levels of healers. The lowest level of traditional healer is a sorcerer who could turn into an animal and usually kind of malevolent sort of thing. And then there's curers, there's other sorts of healers. The wise one is the highest elevated healer. She was a wise one. People came from everywhere to be healed by her. There weren't hospitals around this place, clinics, things like that. Juana de Jimenez, Mexico. She first ate the mushrooms, which she called los niños santos, the little saints, or the little ones who spring up. That she had all these little names for them, but usually it's los niños santos. As a child with her sister, she knew about them. She knew the shamans used them, so she went out, ate some mushrooms with her sister, had a pretty interesting time, and she became a curandera or a healer at the age of 8. Her uncle was dying. None of the other healers in the nearby villages could do anything to save him. It was basically they wrote him off as he was going to die. She didn't want to see that happen. So she went to the jungle, she gathered the mushrooms she knew the healers used, and she went back, she sat down with her uncle, she ate a lot, and she sat there with him. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. First, the same children told her the location of a plant that would heal her uncle. They told her where it was and what the plant was. So she went out in the jungle, found the plant, brought it back boiled, and gave it to her uncle, and he completely recovered, whereas none of the other healers could help him. She also healed her sister. Really interesting story to read her account. Her sister, they thought, was dying too. Again, no one could help her. She ate more of the mushrooms that she had ever eaten in her life. She said, I really ate a lot of it. Went to her sister and started singing, because that's the way she healed. The sounds would come through her to her, and started pressing on her sister's abdomen, right? Working on it, just the way she felt it, just going by what the little saints were telling her to do. There was a discharge of blood and fluid from her sister. Her sister got better. So, I'm sorry, back. So people started coming from all over the place to heal her. They bring her cigarettes. She loved to smoke cigarettes. They bring her cigarettes. They bring her, so she didn't like to take money, but if she needed it, she was always dirt poor. So she would occasionally take gifts. She liked to drink, but not to drunkenness. She drank the local liquor. Next, please. And before Gordon Wasson arrived, she said she had a vision during one of her ceremonies of men with white faces and white hair who were looking for her. So she said when Wasson and his cohorts arrived, she knew that vision was about them. So this is where we start talking about magic, okay? And I'm explicitly all about this stuff. I think it needs to be talked about, right? But some of the more, it makes people uncomfortable. It's already weird enough to talk to people about psychedelics and say, hey, you know what, hey, I'm into psychedelic drugs. To a lot of, normal, straight, capitalist society, that's not cool. So when you start bringing in even weirder stuff, like people having visions of things that happen, okay, but that is a big part of the history. And we can't forget that. Like, we can't overlook that. Next slide. So here's I'll just briefly talk about this. She had this vision after she healed her sister, and this defined how she operated. She said, I knew they were the principal ones. That these were like these entities that were, godlike sort of beings. So they spoke to her. They were seated behind a table in which there were many papers all over it. And she knew they were important papers. She was illiterate. So this is interesting that this is what she would see. There were a number of principal ones, 6 or 8 of them. Some looked at me, others were reading the papers on the table. Others appeared to be searching for something among the papers. I knew they weren't of flesh and bone. Next. I knew that it was a revelation that the saint children were giving me. Right away I heard a voice that was sweet but authoritarian at the same time, like the voice of a father who loves his children but raises them strictly, a wise voice that said, these are the principal ones. On the principal one's table, a book appeared, an open book that went on growing until it was the size of a person. In its pages there were letters. It was a white book, so white it was resplendent, it's a glowing book. One of the principal ones spoke to me and said, Maria Sabina, this is the book of wisdom. It is the book of language. Everything that is written in it is for you. The book is yours. Take it so that you can work. I exclaimed with emotion, that is for me, I receive it. They're giving it to her and she's receiving it. The principal ones disappeared and left me alone in front of the immense book. I knew that it was the book of wisdom. Wisdom is language. Language is in the book. The book is granted by the principal ones. The principal ones appear through the great power of the children, the mushrooms. Next, please. So afterward, the book no longer appeared because she absorbed it. She felt like all the content, it's like the concept of a download, you know. She got downloaded all the information she needed to be a healer in that time that she healed her sister. Then she had another vision. I like this one too. Something fell from the sky with a great roar. It was a luminous object, blinded her. The object turned into a kind of vegetal being, like a bush with flowers of many colors. Its head had a great radiance. Its body was covered with leaves and stalks. You talk to some people when they have really powerful experiences with psilocybin, have some sort of encounter with the vegetal realm, vegetal beings, that sort of thing. When the vision vanished, she's sweating. She realized she was crying. Her tears were crystals that tinkled when they hit the ground. I mean, she's really poetic. And if you read her chants, it's astoundingly beautiful stuff for a woman who was, completely illiterate and never went to school a day in her life. So she whistled and clapped, sounded and danced. And if we get to listen at the very end of the talk, you can hear her. It's amazing. I danced because I knew I was the great clown woman and the Lord clown woman. At dawn, I slept. I woke up, it was morning. I touched my body in the ground to make sure I returned to the world of humans. And her sister got better. Okay, so that's what she's experiencing on the time when she really felt like she became a wise one. I'm not a curer. Okay, those are the ones a little down on the scale, because I do not give potions of strange herbs to drink. I cure with language. I think that's pretty cool. Nothing else. I am a wise woman, nothing else. I am the woman of the winds, of the water, of the paths, because I am known in heaven, because I am a doctor woman. That's from her Life and Chants. Next, please. There's a picture of her. Here's how she would do the velada, okay? I wanted to bring some copal incense. And anybody, you guys ever smelled that? I smelled it when I visited a shaman. One of my friends here was with me in Mexico. And the smell is just intoxicating. It's really clean. So if you ever get a chance to try it, she's holding a pot of copal incense. It's made from a tree resin. And she would take the mushrooms and purify them in the smoke. Over on her little altar, she has pictures of the saints, because her religion was basically the Mazatec religion mixed up with Christianity. It was a syncretic religion. She had no problem with that. Most of the indigenous people who have mixed in Christianity, they have no problem with that at all either. So she has pictures of the saints, and she has flowers, and she smoked the mushrooms, and she would eat them in pairs. One is for the male, one is for the female. So it was always a balance of male and female in the mushrooms. She'd sometimes give them to the people she was healing. If it was a child, she'd just give them a little bit. And then she would sing, and she'd chant, and she'd tap her body like that, and clap, and whistle. And it's astounding, so I hope we can listen to a little bit of it. Next, please. But here's the thing and here's where I'm taking it back to magic again. Okay? There's always had to be a question for the spirits. People just didn't go to take these mushrooms and have a good time. That became a problem after that Life magazine article got published, because all of a sudden, everyone wanted to go see this woman. Everyone wanted to take these mushrooms that caused visions. John Lennon, rock stars were going down there, but also, what they called the hippie drogistas. These hippies would come down. And one of them tried to pay her. He was like, "Oh, Maria Sabina, give me some, I want to take some mushrooms, And she was just pissed at this point. So she said, "Well, what are you gonna pay me?" She knew he didn't have anything. He's like, "Oh, here, how about my dog? Take my dog, okay?" And she's like, "What is it gonna eat? Shit?" She's like, she's a dirt poor woman, and this guy's trying to give her a dog so he can get some mushrooms. So it really became a problem, and there were people eating mushrooms, freaking out in the town. So a lot of her community turned against her. It was really unfortunate what happened. And Gordon Wasson felt bad about it for the rest of his life, really, about some of the stuff she had to endure. Her life was not easy at all. But there always had to be a question. You didn't take mushrooms for fun. You didn't take mushrooms to get to know yourself better. You took them either because you lost something and you were trying to find it, divination, or you were sick and you needed to be healed. So the origin of psychedelic therapy is in, what I consider sort of magical practices. Next slide. And here's what happened. The first time Wasson went to Mexico, he got in touch with this shaman Aurelio Carreras. And Wasson didn't get to take the mushrooms in, he just watched while Aurelio took them. But Aurelio said, "What's your question?" And Wasson's like, what do you mean? He goes, "Well, you have to have a question. You don't come to a shaman without a question." So he said, "Hey, tell me about my son Peter." "Okay, I'm worried about Peter." And he just pulled it out of his, ass. So Carreras, casting corn kernels, kind of like the EEG that Rick mentioned, casting corn kernels, starts telling him, Wasson had said his son was in Boston. And Carreras says, "No, your son's not in Boston. He's in New York." And Wasson's thinking, "Okay, yeah, okay, whatever." And then he says, "He's probably going to join the army soon." And Wasson's like, "He's not going to join the army. That's the last thing in the world he would do is join the army." And he said, "A close member of your family is going to die this year." After Wasson goes back to the States, he goes to his house. He had a house in Boston, a house in New York. He shows up in New York. There's been a party at his house in New York. Peter had decided to go down to New York and hang out with his friends while Wasson was taking part in the ceremony. His son told him he wanted to join the army. He had decided he wanted to join the army, completely out of the blue. And then later that year, a very close member of their family died. Wasson didn't write about this stuff at first. Next slide. There's Aurelio Carreras. He had one eye. Scary looking guy. I mean, imagine him sitting there saying, "A member of your family is going to die." So it was a strange experience for Wasson. Next slide, please. So here's why Wasson said, I'm not writing about this stuff, okay? I'm not publicizing this. He said, "I always had a horror of those who preached a kind of pseudo-religion of telepathy, who for me were unreliable people. If our discoveries were to be drawn by their attention, we were in danger of being adopted by such undesirables," right? So already he's afraid that if he talks about this kind of weirder stuff that's happening, it's going to taint what he saw as a new development in religious studies and spirituality. His wife and his daughter, after he died, also wrote about some of the things they were told, some of the things they saw that then actually turned out to happen. Next slide. But what Wasson did say, kind of cagily went around it, he said, "The sacred mushroom permits you to see more clearly than our perishing eye can see. Vistas beyond the horizons of this life. To travel backwards and forwards in time, to enter other planes of existence, even to know God." Next slide. This guy was the second person to eat, second white, Caucasian, Western guy to eat the mushrooms. He was the photographer, he was a New York photographer, went down with Wasson, joined the first velada with Maria Sabina, and he had a vision of one of these things he couldn't stop thinking about. He just saw a house with a portrait of a caballero, a Spanish caballero, above a mantelpiece. When he got back to Mexico City later, he walked into a place where he'd never been, and there was the painting, and there was the mantelpiece. He was writing about that in 1990. He said, "All these years later, I can't stop thinking about this. It drives me crazy." So Maria Sabina noticed when she was doing that velada with Wasson and Richardson, she said her visions changed. She started seeing cities, things she had never seen before. Big cities, big buildings, big houses. Next. I love this as one of her quotes. Like I said, she's really poetic about her descriptions of things. And this is how she explains what she accesses, like that book of knowledge that was downloaded into her. She says, "There's a world beyond ours, a world that is far away, near, and invisible. And there is where God lives, where the dead live, the spirits and the saints, a world where everything has already happened and everything is known." So that's how she can do the things that she does. Next. Here's an interesting guy. Andrija Puharich. He was a parapsychologist. He studied like psi phenomena, things like that. He was also an MD. He was in the Army. He was working at Fort Detrick in Edgewood, Maryland. Working for the CIA, basically, trying to find drugs that could be used, to brainwash people. But he was also, he had read about this stuff, about these shaman being able to travel in their minds to different places and see things. So he wanted to study that as well. Aldous Huxley thought he was a brilliant guy. There's so much I could talk about the CIA, but I'm going to save that for another talk. I mean, some of the things they did, Rick touched on it. Okay, I'll say one thing, because it's the most hideous thing I've ever read. And that's the program that took place in McGill University in Montreal that Rick mentioned, where they took people, disturbed people who were having a really rough time, who were hospitalized in an institution. They would tape interviews with them, and they would find the most triggering aspect of what they said, like, I was raped when I was a kid by my uncle, something like that. They isolate that tape segment. Then they would take that individual, they put them in a bed, put a helmet on them. It's like a motorcycle helmet. There were speakers inside the motorcycle helmet that would play that tape loop over and over again. This was a guy named Dr. Ewan Cameron, who was at one point head of the American Psychological, I can't remember if it was the APA or another, but he was a bigwig. So they're playing these horrible things in these people's ears, their statements over and over. He called it psychic driving. They're playing this over and over into their ears while they're blasted on extremely high doses of LSD. And they would keep injecting them with LSD. And then, whenever they decided it was going to stop, they would give them sedatives and keep them asleep for days at a time. When they woke up again, bam, in goes the LSD. So the entire time, for weeks at a time, these people are conscious, they're tripping, and they're hearing the horrible things that happen to them broadcast over and over in their head, strapped down in a bed a lot of time. Needless to say, a lot of these people, their lives were completely ruined. Some of them actually sued eventually. I think it was in the 1990s when they actually got some reimbursement from it. But that's the kind of stuff that was going on. That was happening with psilocybin, LSD. It's a really, really shameful part of our history, and a lot of people don't know about it.
Is it true that someone from the CIA accompanied Wasson on
Yeah.
his follow-up trips?
And it's likely because of Puharich, who said, hey, Wasson's found this interesting drug. So yeah, a CIA mole, went with Wasson. He didn't know it. And it was the Geschichter Foundation. It was a fake foundation set up by the CIA that funded one of Wasson's trips. He didn't know it. He's like, oh, this guy's come on. And the CIA guy, he had a bad trip. So that was nice. Okay. Yeah, so this is, you can find this on YouTube. It was a TV show called One Step Beyond. It was like, weird psychic stuff and all that. But this is Andrija Puharich. That's the director of the show. They actually went down. This is how, seriously, people were taking this idea of telepathy and psi abilities because of these drugs. They did a TV show that's Andrija Puharich took the director. They came back from Mexico. They brought the mushrooms with them. And he had designed this thing so you couldn't see what you were touching. So he put a picture down there, blindfold the guy. Now this study would never wash today. I'm just showing it kind of a historical perspective. But at this point, and you can watch this, it's kind of interesting. He's feeling this picture and he's saying it has a great deal of power, like a noise. I don't know how to translate that into a picture, but it seems to have that noise and speed. It's a picture of a waterfall. So again, I have actually been a mentalist. I know how to fake psychic phenomena. That could easily have been a trick, but it does show how serious people took. I mean, and Puharich was really, that was his big thing. And some of you may have heard the remote viewing project that was happening, also in Maryland at Fort Meade. This is what started it all. the idea that these psychedelic drugs could actually facilitate you to travel mentally and see things somewhere else. Next, please. He also, so Puharich said, hey, Gordon, let's do this experiment. The next time when you take the mushrooms, try to come see what I'm doing, and I'll do the same for you. Unfortunately, the dates got mixed up, and Wasson just took the mushrooms a different day than Puharich they were trying to coordinate. But Wasson told Puharich, he said, hey, I see a lab, but it's like in a barn. Puharich had just left the military. I don't know if he left the CIA and never really leave the company. But he had set up his lab in a barn in Maine. Interesting? Anecdotal? Sure. Next, please. Here's another guy, I think Rick mentioned, Stanley Krippner, PhD. He's saying the literature is full of this stuff. The literature of people going out and studying indigenous cultures, they'll tell you, hey man, this stuff happens all the time. But there's also, so this is what the indigenous cultures say. Next, please. He took part in a psilocybin experiment. This is a really cool story too. Again, it's anecdotal, it doesn't mean anything, maybe. So he went on this whirlwind tour in his head. He took psilocybin with Timothy Leary's psilocybin project, Ralph Metzner. So he winds up, funny, Baltimore. You know, Baltimore is this strange, it makes me proud to be a Baltimorean, that like all this psychedelic activity took place in Baltimore. A lot of the research, and it's still happening now. So he takes this mental voyage, winds up in DC, and he's gazing at a bust of Abraham Lincoln, and it begins to darken, and someone says the president was shot. Next, please. A wisp of smoke rises up, and then Lincoln's face changes into Kennedy. The wisp of smoke was still emerging from the gun, and the voice repeated, he was shot, the president was shot. I opened my ears, I'm sorry, it should be eyes, open my ears. Opened my eyes because they were dripping tears. This was a year before Kennedy was shot, but the vision stuck with him. Next, please. Stan Grof, I'm not going to read this, don't worry, but he's really the creator, one of the founders of transpersonal psychology. It's the branch of psychology that takes anomalous experiences and mystical experiences seriously. And the reason he became the founder of transpersonal psychology, he did all sorts of psychedelic research. Psilocybin, mescaline, tryptamine. In the Czech Republic, this guy may have taken more people on psychedelic trips than anyone else. He also, there we go, he was at Johns Hopkins University, Spring Grove State Hospital in Baltimore, where he was the chief psychiatric researcher. There was a ton of psychedelic research done there. Next. And he said he saw so many things happen in his lab, right, that he couldn't deny this stuff anymore. Said scientifically conducted consciousness research has some pretty convincing evidence of what they call the imaginal realm. That's what the Jungians call it. And you know, it aligns with Eastern spiritual philosophies, and even what these primitive cultures are saying. You know, they're saying this stuff's real, and he's saying we're starting to find that out in the lab. Next, please. So he talks about the Jungians, referring to it. He says this is imaginal realm. Imaginal doesn't mean imaginary. The imaginal realm, as people understand it, is a place where you can kind of have the same experience as someone else, and you corroborate stuff. Next, please. So he took part. I mean, these guys were lucky. They're doing these psychedelic studies, so they can be in psychedelic studies too. He started getting answers that scared him. I don't know what exactly this particular test was. I think it was one where you identify what a picture is or something like that. He said, after 3 in a row, it started really freaking him out. Like, the reason for the discontinuation of the experiment was a strange mixture of conviction. It was absurd to test the obvious, because it's happening. On the other hand, what the hell does that do to your worldview if this is really happening, right? That changes everything. Next, please. And how could you do a talk about psilocybin without having Terence McKenna have a quote up here, right? The bard of psilocybin. If you haven't seen Terrence talk, Google him and watch him he's one of the most entertaining people I've ever watched. But very much a smart guy too. Way out there, but also very keyed in. He says, what the alien voice of the psychedelic experience wants to reveal is the syntactical nature of reality. Okay? That the real secret of magic is that the world is made of words. Remember what Maria Sabina says? It's language. I heal with language. And that if you know the words that the world is made of, you make of it whatever you wish. And think about that, how our words shape, we say, oh, that person's a liberal, oh, that person's a Republican, The word builds your reality. And psilocybin can help you sort of separate yourself from that. Next, please. I'm coming to a close, I promise. This is just this guy, David Luke. I think MAPS, Rick's organization, sponsors some of this research. He did an overview of the study of kind of psi phenomena and psychedelic research. Next, please. Here's the problem, though. There were about a dozen controlled studies in psi phenomena before Prohibition hit, shut down all psychedelic research. Here's the problem with studies. When you've got people high, very, very high on psychedelic drugs, and you're telling them to sit and do this repetitive task over and over again. Next, please. You're not going to get the best results. And a lot of these studies, people just start laughing, like, I can't do this anymore. It's just stupid. Why can't we talk? Why can't we do something fun? No, sit and keep pressing the button. And what's interesting, and I'm bringing this to a close. This is, like I said, psychedelics were the third rail of research. This is like the eighth rail. You touch this and you're zapped. But in my private conversations with people doing psychedelic research, the researchers, when I say, wouldn't it be cool to try to go, yeah, it would be. And they would love to do this kind of research. Because a lot of them, when you're sitting with someone who is having a psychedelic awakening for the first time, funny things happen. They say things that, maybe you think, well, how the hell did they know that? Synchronicities happen, stuff like that. It's a very charged experience, a very charged atmosphere, and stuff happens. So a lot of these researchers have seen, they won't say it. Professionally, they don't want to talk about it. But privately, if you say, hey, what if you could do one of these experiments? I would love to. They would love to do it. Whether they get to do it, I'm not sure. Surveys show that, this was an interesting survey that Luke, guy just mentioned it, between 18 and 83% of people, depending on the drug, use cannabis or psychedelics, reported ESP experiences occurring while under the influence. But surveys are terrible science. All they tell us is basically what they tell us. It's not, you can't quantify that really, but it's interesting. Again, anecdotal, right? So Richard Dawkins is sitting there, it's anecdotal, it's nothing, it hasn't been blah, 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 blah. Well, some of this stuff has been tested in the lab. Next, please. This is the summary. Basically, I'm not going to read that, but basically what Luke is saying after looking at all the research is there was some really interesting research done. And some of the findings are very suggestive. But there are problems with it. And we have to fix those problems if we're really going to attack it. But he's saying, and he did a study, next please. He did a very rigorous design of 100 participants and found out that precognitive ability correlated positively with the number of psychedelics consumed by the individuals. So this could either mean you really start to lose your marbles the more psychedelics you take, or maybe that you take more psychedelics and you can access some sort of part of your brain or part of reality that other people might not be. Next, please. And here, I'm going to end with this. This story, when I first read it. Does anybody know Paul Stamets? Yeah. He wrote this book. If you like looking at pretty pictures of mushrooms, man, pick up. These are all psilocybin mushrooms. It shows you what they look like, how to determine, which ones, how to, distinguish them from non-psilocybin mushrooms. And he also owns a company called Fungi Perfecti. He's considered probably one of the most as far as mycological scholars go, he's way, way up there in the pantheon next. This story is nuts. This kind of what started me years ago thinking along these lines, along with the fact that I've had some anomalous type experiences under psychedelics. So he had tripping, taking mushrooms with his friends while he's at college. So he goes and lies down, and then he has this kind of strange dream that sticks with him. Okay, in the dream, he's at college trying to get back to his cabin. He has a cabin in the mountains. He comes to a broad river valley that had been completely flooded. Floating dead and bloated in the frigid sunlight were hundreds and hundreds of cows. The dream abruptly ended, and I awoke in a cold sweat, struck with the fear of impending disaster. I mean, he was sort of like he had come down, but he was still in a little bit of a visionary state, and he has this vision that just knocks him for a loop. Next, please. He went downstairs, told his friends, he's like, man, this is like no dream I've ever had. There's this strangeness, this foreboding aspect to it that I can't shake. It's knocked me like out of the ballpark with how disturbed I am about it. So his friend says, okay, well, when's this going to happen? And he says, I don't know, I just know it's going to be on a weekend. So his friend pointed to a calendar 2 weeks from that evening and wrote, Paul says doomsday on the calendar. Next. 2 weeks later, an unusual temperature inversion moved into western Washington. So the rain starts coming down, hits the Cascades, the snow starts melting because it's so warm, bridges are flooded. So his cabin's 20 feet away from a creek. And all of his books, all of his research, everything he keeps there, all his personal belongings. So the next day, he drove and the bridges are closed. Like he can't get to his cabin, so he's good. Out of the way, really far out of the way. So his cabin's safe, but the river's like 10 feet closer to it. He gets all his stuff out, heads back south to Olympia next. So he enters the Snohomish Valley. I stared in disbelief at hundreds of cattle who, stranded by the rising waters, had drowned overnight. It was December 1st, the exact day my dream had foretold. This single event shattered my concept of linear time. The future can be foreseen. You know, for a guy, you know, that's pretty strong stuff to put in a book. He said, now I know what shamans have known for centuries. The psilocybin experience can facilitate precognition of the future. Next, please. So where does this leave us? The big question is, do we need controlled scientific documentation of this stuff to study it and better understand it? The answer, next please, is kind of, sort of, you know? I mean, scientific validation, if it can be done properly with the proper controls, there's still some who will not accept that they move the goalposts for this stuff. But we can do this. We can test this stuff. Next, please. I'm sorry, go back and forward, backward. But we as a psychedelic community can conduct our own research and data collection. That's why I talk about this stuff. When I talk about this stuff, people come up and tell me their stories. You know, it's like cultural studies rather than scientific, but it's very important anyway. I'm sorry, back. Most importantly, we got to tell our stories to each other. Like, don't hold back on this stuff when it happens. You know, if something like this happens, share it, because the universe is made of stories, not atoms. I love that, and that's what sticks to me. So, thank you very much. Yeah.
Just want to know, Michael, could you give us an example of a insight you gained through psilocybin that directly affected your life or made you who you are?
Well, I'd have to really chop that down to a tiny, tiny story. But the incident that Barbara Bradley Haggerty wrote about, one of my friends is here that was there that night. It was St. Mary's College in Maryland. There's a little church there that's open. I was on psilocybin mushrooms, went into that church by myself, and I think it was a really brief experience the way it happened, and I didn't really tell anybody about it for a long time. But what Maria Sabina kind of describes as a download, like I felt like I got this download. I compare it to like sort of a feeling of grace in the Christian sense, in that. But what I got out of it was I was sort of antagonistic to religion, you know, in general. You know, it happens to a lot of us. But I understood, I'm in this church and I felt like, I get it. You know, it's not inherently a bad thing. You know, the people who have a religious impulse, they're striving for something. It might get corrupted, it might get perverted by what they're taught, but that genuine religious impulse is something that we all have. And that really was like a hammer to the head. And so I'm very sympathetic to religious people, you know. It's very easy, especially in the counterculture, to dismiss crazy Christians or crazy Muslims, you know, fanatics and, you know, all this kind of stuff. I can't do that because I know that what these people are striving for comes from something real and deep. And it's just the way it expresses itself, the way culture, you know, molds them to express it, that is the problem. So that, you know, that was like, you know, it was like a light bulb, but it took a while to process it. It was a feeling, it was a bodily feeling, it was a mental thing, it was a spiritual thing. Yeah.
Hey, my name's Scott. I work for SSEB on the national staff.
Cool,
so
awesome.
Thanks for being here supporting our AU chapter.
Sure.
I'm going to be a little bit of a buzzkill, but there's just one theme throughout the whole presentation, and you acknowledge it, but I have a little trouble reconciling it in my own mind.
Sure.
I use psychedelics on occasion. I've had profound experiences as well. But what I'm not willing to do as an advocate is attach metaphysical jargon to those experiences, and then. So no denigration against, you know, Marie Sabina or Mr. Wasson or Paul Stamets, who I love, any of those folks. But when you take those things that are unexplainable and then sort of mash them together in a very unscientific, unprincipled way, I think it discredits the usefulness of psilocybin more than it actually advances to people who haven't experienced it how important it is. So I just wanted to throw out there that maybe it's better to not say anything rather than just attach our own. You said culture molds people to give these explanations. I think you're right. But isn't there some, of course there's some value in that, but I think that there's some negative aspect to that too that sort of discredits the movement in general. Mushrooms are natural, they're not supernatural. And so when I see people making supernatural or paranormal claims, I have no, as someone who was looking in from the outside, whether I was religious or not, if I'm using logic and reason, I'm going to be, you know, turned off by those sorts of explanations, and I just wonder how you respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. You know, I mean, we're all trying to advance the acceptance of these substances, you know, and your way may work perfectly for you. I mean, the stuff I said, it makes people uncomfortable. But for me to deny the experiences that people have, and they are honestly open and sharing this stuff. Now, Wasson hid it. Okay, he did what you suggest. Don't talk about this stuff. But to me, you know, I'm more of a seeker of truth than a pragmatist, I guess, when it comes to, you know, like I'd love to see medicalization of psilocybin. I don't think that it has to be medicalized with all the spiritual stuff washed out of it. I think that does a disservice to like where it came from, you know? Like it came from traditions that were spiritual traditions. So, and if you look at the Hopkins study, I mean, the study of mysticism is, the people in those studies are talking about God, you know. They're not saying I got really in touch with myself, you know, but they're saying I felt God, you know, like the experience I had. So for me to say, don't talk about that, or that's harmful to what we're doing, I see where you're coming from, and I think that you make a good point, and maybe pragmatically, it would be good to just not talk about this stuff at all.
Maybe not, I'm not saying don't talk about it, but for example, saying that you are having a vision that transcends space and time, that's an extraordinary claim to make, and one that can't be substantiated with evidence. Of course, I can't disprove it either.
Right.
But, you know, I can't disprove the Easter Bunny, you know, so like,
But
saying that
here's
you
the thing.
travel through
Here's the
time,
thing.
that you're seeing a vision.
I don't like the Easter Bunny thing when people do that. Oh God, you can prove you can't prove God. You know, I could just, you know, I could prove the Easter Bunny. That I really think that's a terrible thing, a terrible analogy. Okay, because there are millennia of traditions that are built upon people's spiritual practices. Their spiritual experiences are tangible spiritual experiences. Okay, we may not be able to quantify that. We may never be able to quantify that. That may be outside of the realm of controlled science. But qualitatively, these experiences affect people, they change people, they improve their lives. The people in the Hopkins psilocybin study had very religious tone to a lot of what they did. So we can break that down and say, well, that's just, these neurons fire these, these neurotransmitters that are making this happen. But it doesn't matter, because they are changed because of this. The follow-up of the mysticism study showed that their lives are changed, their traits are changed, the way they interact with people are changed. So while it may be easy to say, well, that's just the chemical soup and the electrical firings of your neurons, to those people, they'll say, so what? To me, it was God. I felt God. I felt spirit. I felt an intelligence, an order. I felt something behind this experience. So, it's fine if you want to study it from a very materialist aspect, and that may be the best way to push it forward towards policy. But there's a whole, ignoring theology, ignoring the study of mysticism, ignoring spiritual traditions that people have had, ignoring actual, controlled studies of people trying to see if this stuff is real. I think you can't, I think it's intellectually designed.
I think that's, I know I've already asked you a question, but I think you're presenting a false dichotomy though. I don't have to ignore it. I'm not saying ignore that, but I don't have to think that it's real. There's a real explanation.
But that's you. You haven't had the experience that I had that made me believe that there's something. There's something there, okay? And I can't prove that to you. I can't talk about ineffable experiences to make you go, oh yeah, you got a point. If you haven't felt it, that's cool by me. But to tell people who have felt a spiritual impulse or some sort of God connection or just something, the words are problematic too. Like, when you say God, instantly all sorts of red flags go. I don't like the word God, but to say what my concept of God would take me 10 minutes to sit here, and we don't have that time. So, there's quantitative science, which is great, cutting things up and finding out what's happening materially, but then there's qualitative science, it's philosophy, theology, sociology, anthropology, things like that actually, they just work a little bit differently. So I think we can hit it from both sides. And you don't have to believe. I'm not asking you to believe.
I'll
Yeah.
piggyback on this actually and maybe marry these ideas together. Kind of playing off what you were saying before, how words form our world. In a sense, these scientific models are our words, are our language. And with the scientific models we create our reality through these models. That doesn't mean that reality is real either. These are models that are useful, that work. We have a lot of models that we can make phones and we can make Skype calls to Rick Doblin. That's all great, but that doesn't mean that it is fundamentally, that these mathematical, scientific physics models are fundamentally true. And so I think that's a key thing that the psychedelics teach us. It breaks down the words and the language, and so, and I don't know, like you're saying, when we talk about the spirituality of it, is there actually this external spirit you're talking to, or is it something, my own subconscious? I think, like you said, it doesn't matter, because you had the experience and it affected you. And I think that's, for me at least, the key takeaway of the psychedelics.
Yeah, I'm not anti-science at all. Like, I support scientific study of this stuff. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of money in it. People are afraid to look at it and things like that. So I'm interested in stories. I'm a storyteller. I write stories about people. I like to listen to people's stories. And I think as a cultural collector of that sort of thing, that's what I'm doing. I'm not asking anyone to believe. But someone tells me a story like Wasson, or Richardson, or these guys who studied in the lab psychedelic experiences, when they start saying they've had these experiences, I'm agnostic. I don't know. I just find it intriguing. Yeah, I think I'm sorry.
The most recent advances in quantum mechanics and quantum physics, particle physics, when we use the term what is real, you know what I mean? What's real to be proved to us out through the Cartesian Newtonian model that we've depended on for so long is, you're not sitting in that chair at all, or I'm not sitting in this chair on a fundamental basis of reality, So there's a guy's book I look called A New Understanding, or there's a documentary or a book called A New Understanding about adhesions.
Mhm.
And I think that's a very good way of putting it, that we're departing from this traditional Cartesian view of the scientifically proven. We're actually going outside and beyond that model. And when science is telling us, well, that can be there and not be there at the same time, and it's proving that.
Mhm.
That's the...
Well, I mean, quantum physics gets adopted in a lot of sloppy ways, you know, and so I'm always, you know, a little hesitant to apply it to things that I don't understand. But you know, quantum physics, if you talk to physicists, if you talk to Niels Bohr, you know, or Wolfgang Pauli, who had a back and forth with Carl Jung about synchronicity and about consciousness and how consciousness affects matter and stuff like that, you know, cutting edge physics gets pretty strange. You know, it's not Newtonian stuff we're talking about, billiard balls. It's consciousness, and how does consciousness affect matter? And why does light function as a wave if we look at it one way, but as a particle when we look at it another? Things like that. It's, you know, so your point is well taken.
I was going to say, we have such a difficult time in our culture integrating these things, because we have so many dualisms, and every time we talk about them, it has to be one thing or the other.
Yeah.
But the psychedelic experience is such an example of a 360-degree experience that you can have 3 or 4 of the characteristics of a psychedelic experience in one trip. Sometimes the deeper emotional, spiritual thing comes after the trip, or a day later. You can have incredible visions that are as real as anything else and never get over it. So I think it's a challenge for anybody who's interested in them or takes them to share them in such a way that they do it responsibly. They don't hype it one way or the other, but they also don't flatten it into something that's so two-dimensional it ignores the rest of the 358 degrees.
Yeah.
And it's a real challenge, and I think the people who are doing research, particularly the neuroscientists, recognize the responsibility that devolves to them to be very careful about how they talk about things, because they don't want to do harm to the reputation of psychedelics, which was done in the 60s, which was wide open, it's fabulous, everybody should do it.
Yeah.
Wrong answer. That was proven false. So I think we all have to be very careful how we talk about them, who we talk to them about, but you also have to be honest, and you have to tell people, this happened to me, it was totally real, I saw gigantic snakes with skulls, and they devoured me, and you know, whatever. And at the same time, tell them it was one of the most powerful experiences of my life, and et cetera, et cetera. You have to be able to talk about it in such a way. It's part of coming out. It's part of psychedelics coming out and being integrated in our society, that we are comfortable talking about them in the 360-degree ways, that we make people realize that we're normal people, we're not crazy, and that the experience is not going to make you crazy.
Right.
So it's a barrier, and we're working through it. We're at the beginning stages of
Yes,
this.
it's a great time to be alive. I mean, you know, to watch this happen and see, you know, the activity that's going into bringing these things more to consciousness again after they've been shoved so far under the rug for so long.
And I just want to say one thing, like, you know, for our society, right, it just so happens that scientific research is kind of the doorway in. And it's the way our society is, for better or worse, you know, medicine is a way that we can, say, mainstream psychedelics. That's kind of what we're seeing right now.
Yeah.
But I think to what you're saying on this, though, is it's more than that. Psychedelics are not just fixing people who have something wrong. There's, well, what about use for creativity? What about the fundamental question, which is consciousness? We're talking about consciousness, the essence of reality. What is this thing? And you know, and to reduce reality to just a materialistic cause and effect is kind of the opposite of what the psychedelic experience maybe tells you, and what quantum mechanics tells you in some ways. And so, and it's a very hard conversation to have. Like you're saying, like it's hard to talk about this. You know, like, well, our consciousness affects reality, and but when you think about that sentence, like, well, no shit, it does. Like, you know, this room is here because conscious effort went into creating this space.
Right, yeah,
So,
exactly.
Anyway, not a question so much as just
Well, I'll just say, you know, I'm not proselytizing that, you know, we should all run out and say psychedelics make you a psychic person and you can travel around the world, stuff like that. I'm just saying that let's just listen to people's stories, right? You don't have to buy it. You might be able to gain something from the story even if you don't think it's really happened. You know, a lot of things don't really happen. There are a lot of things you can't cut up and measure. I love my kids. You can't put my love on a scale, but I know it's real. So qualitatively things we feel that you're never going to be able to measure, but that doesn't mean they're not real. That's all I'm saying. So thank you guys. Great conversation.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you so much, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.